Hello, welcome back everyone from lunch. Hope you had a lovely lunch and feel refreshed. I'm sure you'll all agree this morning has been wonderful. We've had some really thought-provoking and some inspiring sessions, and this afternoon is the exact same. This afternoon we have our first session that we're opening with is from Professor Deborah Harding, Professor of Learning and Innovation at St George's University, Dr Sue Folds, reader and chair from the boards in the Department of Health Studies at University of York, and Dr Hilary Walsgrove, Associate Professor in Advanced Clinical Practice. This is a pre-recorded session, as unfortunately they were unable to join this afternoon, and the session is on developing supervisors for advanced practice.
Okay, so welcome to this recorded session for the AAPE conference, where we're talking about developing supervisors for advanced practice. And we're thinking about what exists and what else we might need. I'm really delighted to be joined today by two colleagues, and we'll introduce ourselves in just a moment. My name is Deborah Harding, and I am the Supervision Assessment Lead for Advanced Practice and Allied Health with NHS England, formerly with Health Education England, and a Professor at St George's University of London. And I'm joined by Dr Sue Folds and Dr Hilary Walsgrove, who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm Sue Folds. Excuse me, I'm reader at the University of York. So my involvement really with advanced clinical practice at this point is in terms of the educational development of programmes, students and supervisors.
Hello, I'm Hilary Walsgrove. I'm the Associate Professor in Advancing Clinical Practice at AECC University College in Bournemouth. Been involved in lots of programme delivery and practice delivery around advanced practice over the last 20 or so years.
Thank you both. So Sue and Hilary have both completed pieces of work commissioned from NHS England over the last few months, helping us to form our thoughts around what we need to do to develop educators and supervisors in advanced practice. And I twisted their arms to come and join me to make this presentation for you today, because I think it's useful to hear how we're collaborating and the different insights that different people involved in this work are bringing to the table. So our plan is to share with you our thoughts about the development of supervisors for advanced practice with reference to some of the supervisor fundamentals and the history that many of you listening will already be familiar with. So a bit of revision around that, but it's important for us to keep revisiting that context and using that as our anchor. Existing guidance and governance and how that might shape what we need to do in terms of developing educators and supervisors, what supervisors might need to know, what already exists in terms of training and developing educators and supervisors, and then a little bit of a thought about what the future might look like. What might good supervisor development be? And we're conscious that what we're providing for you here is an NHS England perspective, but we're hoping that you will find transferable themes if you work in different parts of the United Kingdom or internationally. And we know that there are similar pieces of work going on across the nation. So it's useful for us to have this opportunity to share what we're doing and to identify where some of those synergies might be. It's a recorded session, so that makes the questions, comments and observations bit that would traditionally come at the end a little bit more of a challenge. And so what we're going to encourage you to do is to use the conference chat functions to post your thoughts, your questions, your comments and your observations. We're not presenting here what we think are the definitive answers, but some of the things that we're exploring and observing as this work unfolds. And so thoughts that colleagues who are listening in today have will be really useful in helping to inform that ongoing work. So please do use that function. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of my involvement in this work around supervision for advanced practice. When I was asked by what was then NHS England to think about what supervision might be needed to support advanced practice development, that was a relatively new world for me. My world was more about supervision than it was about advanced practice. And there were some thoughts at that point that maybe what we needed were some training or e-learning materials for advanced practice supervisors. And I think there's definitely a need for that. But at that point, what I quickly concluded was our first step was to get some clarity about the advanced practice landscape and what supervisors were supervising in advancing practice. And so colleagues will be familiar that in England, we then produce these fundamentals of supervision in advanced practice in a publication that we're currently starting to look at refreshing, and accompanying that's the minimum standards to guide advanced practice workplace supervision for those in training. And I'll just give a little bit of a revision here and for the benefit of those who may be less familiar with this piece of work. What we were encouraging from having listened to colleagues across the advanced practice space, what we were encouraging was to start by thinking what's expected of that practitioner in the advanced practice space. What are they going to be doing? What's the work environment and the advanced level activities that individual is going to be facing on a day-to-day basis and needs to be equipped to deal with. And that then helps to inform the advanced level competence and capability, and to some degree helps us then identify which professions will add value in the at an advanced level in that space, but also which professions have within their scope of practice and their registration the potential to meet those capabilities. So we know with some areas of advanced practice, I'm thinking in emergency medicine, for example, where the Royal College of Emergency Medicine curriculum is the guide, there will be some professions who can work to that level and others who cannot. So it's important to identify that early on, because that then helps us to see we have different professions who might have different starting points. They'll need individual plans and supervision to match that. And that supervision is also required to support them from expert to novice, a really challenging transition from a familiar, traditional, often uni-professional role where you feel you're already, and you know, and your colleagues recognise you as working at a very elevated and sophisticated level, to that advanced level, and that feeling of having gone from expert to novice, which is a difficult transition, and where supervision again is really an important part of the picture. And then what we proposed was, this is quite a complicated supervisory landscape, and it would be good to have a supervisor, a coordinating education supervisor, who follows someone in training through their training, helps to support their progression through their towards their level of advanced practice, and are with them for the whole of that journey ideally. And then access to a range of associate supervisors, and that's set out in the minimum standards, with the recommendation that you have access as a trainee to supervision at least once a week, and that 1 in 4 of those should be with that coordinating supervisor who's supporting your entire journey. And then we also recognised in those fundamentals that we're asking quite a lot of individuals here who are providing the supervision, so we need to invest in them. They have an important role in assuring the level of practice has been reached, and so we need to invest in supervisors who have this valuable role. So as I said, we're now thinking about revising, not revising, but refreshing this work, because it is a rapidly changing landscape. And you're going to hear from colleagues in a moment that they have similar observations about the difficulties of working in the supervision and education space in advanced practice in what is a very rapidly evolving aspect of healthcare practice. But we're beginning with supervisor development, because what we hear is, yes, those fundamentals are great, but what about supervisor development? How should we be developing supervisors to meet these roles? So we realised that there were some things that in this piece of work, I'm doing this work with colleagues across the regions in England. So we have supervision assessment leads across the different regions in the health service in England. And I'm very fortunate to work with a really knowledgeable and motivated team of supervision assessment leads. And between us, we realised that the things we needed to understand a bit more about were what are the regulators and professional bodies saying about supervision to make sure we align and we complement what they're saying. And also, we had a hunch that there was probably some training and development that was already in the system that would be useful in this space, and we shouldn't ignore that that existed. So we commissioned 2 pieces of work to look at that. And the first of those was about the regulator and professional bodies piece. And that's the piece that Hilary delivered for us. And I'm going to hand over to Hilary to talk us through some of the observations and outcomes from that.
Thank you. Okay, so I was looking at really capturing that picture of supervision for healthcare professionals. I thought this was going to be easy and I was just going to get all the answers from looking at the guidance documents, but that soon came clear that that wasn't going to happen. So I started off by just sort of looking at a background and the context, which came really from the Francis report, things like the long-term plan, the NHS People Plan, 5-year forward view, amongst other key documents that really sort of started that kind of focus on supporting and valuing staff, CPD linked to the workforce development, patient-centred care, and all of those elements that sort of focus on needing to have good supervision and people who are able to deliver that care through, having developed appropriately. Also looked at the CQC guidance and recommendations that came back in 2008 and then further in 2013 to help with that kind of background picture. So it was clear from that supervision was going to be needed at the forefront of whatever all of these people were doing within the practice settings. Thank you. Should have said next slide. Okay, so with that as the background, I then looked at specifically the professional bodies in terms of the NMC, HCPC, and I'm never quite sure how to say this, the General Pharmaceutical Council about supervision. I deliberately didn't look at the medical education supervisor side of things because I thought it was better to focus on the area that we would end up having advanced practitioners obviously involved in. So what were those professional bodies saying about supervision? Well, what I was finding is that this was mainly focused, as it should be, on pre-registration supervision, links to their codes and their standards of practice. Across those key registrant bodies, as well as within the individual professional body documents. So obviously under the HCPC, things like the CSP, the Council of paramedics and so on, so that the real sort of profession specific documents as well. There was a range of different terms even around what supervision meant, what they should be called, whether they were supervisors, assessors, and so on. And also then around the sort of role descriptors. So there were differences and it wasn't always clear how you could actually pick out supervision distinctly from sort of educator or assessor or mentor or whatever it was. So it was not an easy task to actually sort of pick out what supervision looked like from a professional body's perspective. Where post-registration came into that, certainly where professionally recordable qualifications were involved, there was more emphasis on the requirements for supervision, so the specific requirements for supervision, such as you would get with the non-medical prescribing. But other than that, as I say, it was particularly relevant around pre-registration and really minimal that might be considered within the advanced practice realms. Thank you. Okay, so in terms of the collective supervision themes that I pulled from bringing all of those bodies together, I considered those in relation to the Health Education England's quality strategy and their quality framework, and also the workplace supervision documents that Debs has just shown us as well. So bringing those all together and feeling through some themes that were coming out, there were some fairly consistent shared standards of proficiency and supervision from those documents that we're looking at. That certainly linked to the standards for CPD and remaining on the register if we're looking at post-registration practitioners. And what was coming to the fore was that, you know, the requirement was to obviously be in a position to provide effective supervision, which would enable safe practice, having an oversight of the practitioner's practice, providing support, providing feedback, and also that alignment to specific frameworks for practice, although that was, you know, fairly vague in terms of what the meaning of that was. But this was all tending towards a kind of a secure place for professional registration. And this is where I would sort of certainly bring in the fact that we need to look at advanced practice in terms of the fact that it isn't a registrable qualification, and perhaps that's something that we need to have in the back of our minds as we look towards developing appropriate supervision for advanced practice. And here again, in terms of a rapidly changing themes, as soon as I pulled all of this information together, new documents were coming out that were starting to make me think, oh gosh, here we go again, we need to pull this in and look at this, and there's some other elements here that relate to supervision and what supervisor roles should look like and so on. Okay, thank you. So just to really sort of sum up in terms of what was there in the review, was this thing around the importance of supervision in the light of advanced practice not being a registrable qualification, because a lot of what was coming out of the review was that it was all a little bit vague. There was nothing that was kind of prescribed particularly, unless it was in specific situations such as non-medical prescribing or others that link to something within professional registration. So nothing specific, no formal requirements, nothing prescriptive about how often or by whom that supervision should take place. It was very much dependent on the individual, the professional needs, or should it be more directed? So there wasn't anything very, very obvious there. Yes, it kept, you know, various different documents kept talking about supervisors being suitably trained, appropriately trained, that they should have this particular skill set or not was not clear. So the how, by whom, the contents was not really coming to the fore in terms of what that should look like. And how to ensure a sort of nationally agreed curriculum really around what that supervision should look like and how we could use it from a transferable point of view with advanced practice. The need to receive ongoing support to reflect on and develop one's own supervisor role was certainly a key point to bring to the fore, but what would that consist of? What would that actually look like? So ended up really with more questions than answers or ways of going.
Thanks, Hilary. And I think that's I'm just going to go back to your slide for a second there, but I think that's the value actually of having commissioned this piece of work, because as a group, when we were starting to look at what does supervisor and educator development need to look like, we had a lot of hunches and thought we knew what was out there in the sort of regulatory literature. And we had some feelings that there were some contradictions and there were some common themes. But until someone goes and does a dedicated piece of work to have a look at that in a systematic way, as you did, we're kind of guessing. And now we know that there is a lumpy landscape that we are working with. And I think, you know, it gives some explanation to why we're struggling a little bit to really nail down what the learning and development needs are, or what learning and development offer should look like what for this part of the workforce. So thank you for having done that piece of work, because it's helped us to answer some of our uncertainties, and we now know that there is the ambiguity we thought there was. But it makes me think that in the learning and development space, if we're creating learning and development opportunities for educators and supervisors, it needs to pay attention to what those different registrant responsibilities might be. It needs to think about and reflect what employer responsibilities are, and we know those are embedded in the Health and Social Care Act in England, and similarly in the other nations. We have, this is from NHS Scotland, from the Health and Care Staffing Act in Scotland. They have similar requirements for employers to provide supervision, ensure that staff are adequately trained, and so on. So if we have learning and development materials for educators and supervisors, it needs to understand that in that legislative landscape. We need to build on the fact that employers are starting to see that they have responsibilities in that space, and how can we work effectively with employers to ensure that time gets protected for supervisors and educators in the workplace and in their job plans. And as Hillary's indicated, you know, it's a rapidly changing landscape. So just a couple of weeks ago, we have some more guidance that comes out, this specifically around supervision guidance for primary care. So it's one way you need to prepare yourself as an educator and a supervisor to be pretty agile and to stay kind of tuned in to the developments that are going on across the nations and internationally, and to attend to some very specific governance requirements, whether that's about some of the obvious things, for example, like prescribing, where there's very specific guidance, or the specific requirements that there are around apprentices and their learning journey. So that kind of brings us on to our second question, which was what training exists. We know there are conferences, short courses, people talk about becoming part of learning sets, doing PG certs, using e-learning. So it feels like there's quite a lot of stuff out there. But again, we had hunches, but we didn't know. And that's when we called on Sue to have a look at this for us. Sue.
Thank you. So this was a really interesting project to do, and something that I didn't think would be quite as difficult or challenging as it turned out to be. And so what we were commissioned to do is to look at opportunities that existed in higher education institutes and other organisations that could be brought together to potentially look at what supervision training is out there. And it was really challenging to capture what actually exists. There are, as Deborah said, there's multiple opportunities and possibilities. E-learning, supervision days, directed study, all sorts of different things. And my question was, at that point, is this training or education? And I know sometimes we use the terms, or the terms are used interchangeably, but I'm really keen to explore the fact that they're not. So training is, you know, I used the analogy earlier with other people around basic life support. So we all train to do basic life support. It's a psychomotor skill. Great, we train and we learn how to do that. What we don't necessarily do until you move up to maybe advanced life support or looking at other things is looking at the clinical decision making underneath that. What's led to this? What do we do? How do I know the actions that I'm doing are appropriate? So it's more about that educational phase, and how do we assure that people are getting that knowledge and skills so that they can use those transferable skills into other places. So that then led to questions around formal and informal. Do we want credits or not? So most HEIs, universities will offer credits. And with that credit becomes an instant quality assurance process that means that we actually know what's being delivered, how it's being delivered, and how it's being seen externally. So other training organisations, Royal Colleges, private organisations have their own quality assurance mechanisms, but how do we know what each of these do, what each of these look like? So increasingly finding lots more questions. Who are the stakeholders for supervision? We have to remember about our patients and our clients and our public. Supervision and clinical supervision particularly is all about, for me, protecting the public. Everything I do as an educator these days, having moved from clinical practice, is around protection of the public. And that's a really challenging place to be. And it's an even more challenging place to be, as both Hilary and Deborah have said, that it's rapidly changing. I completed the work, sent it off to HEE on the Friday, and on the Tuesday, another document came out that was really, really interesting, that actually added to some of the detail that I was finding. So lots of questions.
Thanks, Sue. And again, it's kind of confirmed the picture that we thought there was. It's confirmed our hunches, but it's given us some really useful evidence. And I'm going to come back to Sue a little bit later in our presentation with some thoughts that Sue has been having around what the future of educator and supervisor development might look like for the advanced practice context. Linked to this, I suppose, is that a couple of our supervision assessment lead colleagues in the regions in NHS England conducted a survey around the same sort of time to look at how supervision investment, so the supervision fee that's given to organisations, how's that being used? And some thoughts from them, a question specifically about what sorts of training were colleagues out in practice currently accessing. So some overlap with the sorts of things that Sue was finding. Accessing some of the traditional medical education supervisor training, the GP education supervisor training, some people accessing Health Education England supervision videos as a way of supplementing their development as supervisors, accessing e-learning for health modules, using the readiness checklists that have been produced by the Centre for Advancing Practice, having local supervisor development frameworks in place, and those included self-assessments, accessing in-house training and other forms of training here. The FCP roadmap supervisor training was mentioned, higher education training courses, the RChem and FICM, so the Royal College of Emergency Medicine and the Faculty of Intensive Care Medicine training around supervision. So quite that real mix of different sorts of training and development opportunities and learning opportunities. But what's really striking about the pie chart is that 40% were accessing nothing at all. So we've got a gap here for developing supervisors and educators, which my colleagues Heather Nesbitt and Kirsty Lang had identified in that work that I shared with you on the previous slide. And we need to think about how we close that gap. I don't think any of us are arguing about that. Sometimes what we hear from colleagues, and also I think sometimes a hunch we have ourselves, is that there's not enough money or there's not enough funding or we need more investment in supervision. And I don't think any of us would argue with that. I think we do need more investment in supervision and educator development across the system. But what's interesting is even when there is funding for this, we're not consistent in the ways that we're using it. There's a real mix of ways in which people use that funding. So again, Heather and Kirsty's survey show that some people are using that to develop their supervisors through education supervisor training. Others are releasing colleagues from their duties to ensure they can provide supervision. They're involved in professional networks, perhaps investing in coaching skills, getting external coaching or mentoring, investing in the off-the-job learning, practices really using it as they wish, which probably is a bit of a smokescreen for a number of different ways in which we might be using this money. So I think there's some uncertainty in the system about how best to use it, and the work we're engaged in here and why we've been collaborating with colleagues like Hilary and Sue is to try and find a workable approach that will help us to spend that money when we have it and to invest in supervision in ways that matter and will make a difference and improve the quality of supervision and education in the workplace. So we're starting to think about what the core knowledge and skills for all supervisors will be. And I don't really want to start calling these capabilities or competencies at the moment. I just want to talk about the domains where we need to invest in our learning and development. And that's in terms of the purpose of supervision. We've heard some of that uncertainty. Hilary referred to different definitions of supervision in different professions, documents and guidance. What are we talking about, and what's the purpose of supervision? Sue spoke just a few slides back about that safety element, keeping the public and professionals safe. We need to ensure that people have considered different supervision models and approaches and how those might be useful. Some models and theories about the acquisition of skills and how those might apply in practice, engaging with critical reflection, modelling that for your trainees and your supervisees, approaches to feedback and facilitation, having a really clear focus on practitioner and learner, supervisee, their individual learning needs. So we spoke at the beginning about the fact we've got different professions, different registrations, different starting points. They're likely to have a variety of different learning and development needs as they move to advanced level. Establishing a conducive learning environment and drawing attention to the individual registrant responsibilities. So Hilary spoke about the fact we don't have a registration for advanced practice. You remain registered in your own profession. You have responsibilities as a registrant to engage in supervision, to engage in continuing professional development, and to do things that you feel equipped to do in practice, not to stretch beyond your scope of practice. And none of this is new or unique to advanced practice, and I think that's important for us to stress. But it might have been neglected, and this is a slide I shared with you last year about our tendency to invest heavily in our clinical pillar, but much less so in our research and leadership and education. And I know colleagues in leadership and research might argue that they're just as neglected as education, but you'll be unsurprised to know that I am going to say I think education is serially neglected throughout our careers. There are some additional considerations when we're talking about the knowledge and skills we need for advanced practice supervisors and educators. So there are those multi-professional considerations I've referred to, different starting points, different scopes of practice, that transition to a non-traditional role, and this sense of not being separately registered or regulated. There's often more of a need in advanced practice to have assessment, verification and sign-off as part of your supervisor role. And so we need to develop supervisors who have an understanding and a grasp of and are able to use valid, fair, reliable, specified approaches to assessment and sign-off. They need awareness of a curriculum or the credentials that the individual they're supervising is working towards at an advanced level. And they need to be appraised of the learning route that individual is undertaking. So is it a retrospective portfolio? Is it an MSc in advanced practice? Are they an apprentice? And what are the different requirements in terms of progressing through those different routes? So those core knowledge and skills that we shared on the previous slide will need augmenting through development of advanced practice supervisors. I just want to encourage you to take a moment to reflect. I'm going back to this idea of a kind of imbalance between our investment in ourselves as clinicians and the other pillars of our practice. But if you consider an aspect of clinical practice you feel secure about, think about how you got to feel secure. Are there ever times now when things surprise you or you feel uncertain about this secure aspect of practice? How do you decide if you have the necessary clinical capabilities? And what do you do when you encounter some uncertainty in an otherwise secure aspect of your practice? So thinking about that in the clinical pillar. What are the implications for that way of thinking as you develop as a supervisor? How will you become secure in practice? My suggestion to you is it will take time and a spectrum of development activities, just as it will have done for you to feel secure in a clinical aspect of your practice. And even that when you're secure in an aspect of practice, we do sometimes need to refresh and update. So you might feel secure as a supervisor, but how are you continuing to invest in your development as a supervisor, just as you continue to invest in yourself as a clinician? And even in our secure aspects of practice, we sometimes need to seek a second opinion. And I think sometimes we expect rather too much of supervisors, that they're going to be omni-knowledgeable, omni-skillful. And that's why this integrated approach, where you have one person following you through, but access to a number of different associate supervisors, is a way of ensuring that we get that breadth of knowledge and skills in the advanced practice supervision space. So apply your clinical pillar mindset to your supervisor development. Identify your supervisor development priorities, whether they're core or the additional ones we've described. Have supervisor-related appraisal objectives. Include supervisor-related evidence in your continuing professional development portfolio, because that's the profession you will stay registered in at this point in time. Look for a range of development opportunities, courses, your own supervision, personal reflection, e-learning, conferences, webinars, learning sets, communities of practice. Don't assume that there will be an off-the-peg, one-stop shop that will suddenly have you feeling as capable as a supervisor as you do currently as a clinician. And consider your registrant and employer responsibilities in terms of investment in supervision and investment in continuing professional development, including in your education pillar. Again, a slide I shared with you last year, but I think worth sharing again, this idea that our other pillars of practice, clinical research and leadership, are strengthened by weaving through both education and supervision. So what might good supervisor development look like, and can we build on what already exists? And I'm going to hand back to Sue for some thoughts I know she's had here.
Thank you. So as part of the project that I was talking about with the scoping review, I went out to all the HEIs and supervision and assessment leads and reviewed lots of documentation that came through, and was very struck on the diverse nature of what is available, but also arguably how far ahead medicine is with this. Lots of probably debates that we could go into about theoretical ways that medical education has developed. But actually what I thought was really interesting is the tiered approach that they have well established in medicine. And as an opportunity, looking at as well the development and long-term plan. We know that in HEIs we're getting older. We have challenges with wanting to bring new people in to HEIs who bring with them that research, that leadership, that clinical element to combine with education. To actually think about how do we move between settings, between HEIs, research settings, between leadership roles, between clinical roles, recognizing everything that people bring with them, and how do we do that through a way of enabling maybe a thread of supervision, education, training, support throughout it. So I kind of have used some of the medical tier training to look at a way that we could potentially do this, recognizing that we need people to train, to learn, to educate. But during a student journey, there's a huge amount of education. There's a huge amount of peer learning that can take place. And also that kind of upstream education that comes from having students and being the educator, being the supervisor. So the starting point for this is really that we have trainees as educators, and that they will evolve with the right skills developments to actually progress into a point where they develop the skills to be able to support the education learning of other people, and draw on that expertise and experience that they'll gain from workplace supervision into moving up into the coordinating workplace supervisor that's been talked about. So that's kind of the starting point. And what I wanted to do here is something that I've worked with people who've done these roles and found a real challenge about having the kind of clinical academic role. And I think we are moving into a space where we really truly appreciate and are finding ways to work now with these kind of clinical academic roles with clinical teaching fellows. Primarily at this point, it's about development and taking the skills and experiences that people have, saying how do we facilitate and support you? How do we draw on your fantastic experience and support you to move from, primarily a clinical role into a role where we can support you with really understanding how education, training and learning works, the theoretical elements that maybe you don't have, because I think there's an assumption sometimes that as healthcare professionals, everybody can teach, everybody can facilitate learning and education, and that's, in my opinion, that's not always the case. There are more things, in the same way that Deborah talked about needing to reflect on your clinical pillar, that we can reflect on here. So moving forward with that academic turn and starting to think about how we could develop that and how we could move through into having a framework for that to happen. So I just picked on two that I'm familiar with, the trust through professional standards. So the Academy of Medical Educators has really moved forward with this as a brilliant programme, and lots of postgraduate certificates, MScs, focused on medical education. The other side of that, we have an advanced HE, which we use in HEIs to give us that professional standards. Some of you may be old enough to remember the NMC portfolio to become a registered qualification as a teacher. And I remember working really hard and being very proud of achieving that, having moved through advanced HE descriptors and portfolios to get fellowship, and then now senior fellowship. I'll be able to take that to the NMC and say, look, I'm confident in my skills and abilities, and having that peer assessment of having achieved the knowledge, skills and behaviours, competence, capabilities, whichever terms we want to use, to say that actually, yes, my knowledge and skills is trusted to this point. So that's my final kind of point, is that we need to be thinking about how we want to move forward and how we want to ensure ourselves that we have trust in our own skills and abilities, so that we can have the trust of other people.
Thank you, Sue. And I think just to kind of pull that together, I think we're starting to see this being recognised across the systems as well. Certainly in England, we've now seen an educator workforce strategy being developed. So I think we should be optimistic. We need to engage in the implementation of these strategies as educators and supervisors. And we're getting close to finding some really core learning and development principles for advanced practice supervisors, which are coming soon. In essence, we haven't got any magic. We haven't shared any magic with you here, but we do think it's important, and we hope you see that it's important for us all to keep collaborating. I'm conscious that we're really running close to our time for our slot. So I just want to finally encourage you again to keep your comments or pop your comments in and observations into the chat function, and by all means contact me directly. My email on the bottom of the slide here. Thank you so much to Hilary and Sue for joining me in this endeavour today. It's been really lovely to work with you and to be able to showcase that work in this way, and thanks to everybody else for listening.